you're in a position where you make decisions that affect other people, sometimes maybe even a lot of other people, hundreds or thousands of others. But at the neighborhood barbecue, you can't really even tell people what you do. When you're around acquaintances, you can't explain your job. They really don't understand when you begin to talk about it. You solve complex problems, but nobody sees the work behind this. And when they do see the outcomes, they have no idea what went into it or that you even played a role in it. You carry a weight that nobody understands. Now, if that's you, the book of Daniel has something to say about leading from the shadows. So let's give a little background on Daniel, or Daniel, as it would have been pronounced originally. The name is composed of two parts, Dan and El. Dan means judge or judgment, and El means God. So the literal meaning of his name would have been God is my judge, or God judges. And of course, that's a very applicable name for Daniel and his life. Now, before we get into more of his background, I want to read our key scriptures today that we should take into context. These really cover, I think, the pinnacle of his life, and it's really what we're driving toward through the whole episode. So let's go over to the Bible, and we're going to read through some verses out of Daniel chapter 6. Then Daniel began distinguishing himself above the administrators and the satraps because an exceptional spirit was in him. And so the king planned to appoint him over the whole kingdom. Then the other administrators and satraps began to seek to find a pretext against Daniel in connection with the kingdom. But they were not able to find any pretext in corruption because he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption could be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any pretext against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." It really says a lot about him, doesn't it? So we're going to scroll on down to verse 7 now. And the administrators of the kingdom and the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, and the governors took counsel and have agreed to establish an edict of the king and to enforce a decree that whoever will seek a prayer from any god or human, except for you, for up to 30 days will be thrown into the lion pit. And then we'll scroll down to verse number 10. Now, when Daniel realized that the document was signed, that's the document that's pronouncing this edict, he went to his house. Now he had windows in his upper room that were open toward Jerusalem, and 3 times daily he knelt on his knees and prayed and gave praise before his God, just as he had been doing previously. So Daniel was certainly a man of faith, and what we're reading here is something that happened a little further in the story than maybe where we're going to begin today, but it's important to keep in mind. So to give a little background, Daniel was taken as a teenager. He was probably 15 to 17 years old in Nebuchadnezzar's first siege of Jerusalem. That would have been 605 BC. Now, Daniel was probably born of royal or noble birth. He was physically healthy, he was intellectually sharp, and he was culturally adaptable. He was, we might say, someone with a lot of potential. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar and his leadership would have noticed this, and so they would have put him into the special training programs to take advantage of that. So within 3 years, Daniel had really advanced. He had moved up really quick in the kingdom. He was advising the king, he was interpreting dreams, and he was even made the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. And that means that he had very few people who had authority over him, but he had authority over a lot at this point. Now, one of the things he did, as I mentioned, is interpreting dreams. Dream interpretation is something that maybe we need to spend just a moment on. Daniel's dream interpretation wasn't fortune telling, or it wasn't some sort of trickery. Now, the other advisors of Nebuchadnezzar may have been doing one or both of those things, but Daniel was taking the dream to God and letting God interpret the dream, and then Daniel was giving the message that God gave him. So Daniel really was just the mouthpiece that conveyed the meaning of the dream that, again, came right from God. The dream interpretation, it ended up playing a very important role in Daniel's advancement, and we see that throughout the book of Daniel. He ended up serving over multiple regimes, and we'll kind of pick that apart a little bit more in a few minutes, but that alone is a pretty amazing feat. He was known to be an outstanding crisis manager, so when things were going really bad, Daniel seemed to be the one that got the phone call. He would have done work that I think would have probably been very private. It would have maybe only been in the presence of the king, or maybe a small group of leaders that were very close to the king. And few people would have known of Daniel's advice to the king, other than those that maybe the king had made aware of that. He was also very good at what he did. And so that means that things were running really well. Now, those of us in leadership know when things are running really well, no one knows you're there. And that's really what you want. But for many people, that's tough because you feel invisible when things are running really well. And that would have been much of Daniel's life. He dealt with private and sensitive matters. And even though he was serving in a foreign land, and a very secular foreign land, or at least a foreign land that was certainly not serving the God that he served, Daniel remained very serious about his spiritual life. And one example of that is what we read a minute ago from the Bible. He prayed 3 times a day. That's just one example, but Daniel was faithful to his Lord. He served in a very high pressure role. For one example, interpret the dream or be executed, and we're going to execute other people too. Or sharing bad news with Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom is finished. Or facing the possibility that, guess what, you've just prayed to someone other than Nebuchadnezzar, we're going to throw you in a lion's den. Now, all of this really, it probably made, as I've already stated, it probably made Daniel feel very alone in this foreign land. There was really no one he could talk to. In the story of Daniel, we know of 3 others, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but it doesn't seem that they were anywhere near the level Daniel was. And so Daniel probably served a very lonely life. He probably didn't really have anybody he could talk to about what was going on in his day-to-day life except for God. Now, that didn't stop him from doing very well at what he did. And I already alluded to this earlier. He served a very long time. He served under 3 or 4 regimes. That would have taken place over a total of 70 years. Now, for those of you in any sort of leadership role, I want you to think about that for a moment. The lifespan of most leaders is certainly not 70 years. In fact, as regime changes happen in corporate America, whether that's a new CEO, a new board, your company's been bought out, whatever that may be, there's often regime changes that happen as part of that. But Daniel survived several of those regime changes, and I think that speaks to the quality of work and advice that he was giving the leaders. Now, Daniel did this because he led a principled life. He was faithful first to an audience of one, that's God. We see in Daniel 6:10, again, as I've already mentioned, he prayed 3 times a day, regardless of recognition. He was excellent in what he did and did not need recognition for that. In Daniel 6:3, it's noted that he had an excellent spirit that was noticed by others. He didn't achieve noteworthiness by self-promotion, as we often see in our world today. And I think that's another great example of how we need to apply this in our own lives. He influenced through character, not title. His counsel was sought because of who he was, not what he demanded. And by the way, when I say who he was, that's not because Daniel himself was particularly noteworthy in the eyes of this foreign kingdom, other than he did a really good job. He was excellent at what he did. But he worked for God first. God was his ultimate king and his judge, not the king of the kingdom, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, but it was God that he served. He didn't need human approval. He didn't need he didn't need some human to pat him on the back and tell him he did a good job or to judge his work. God was both of those things for him. And when no one in the world understood what he did, he knew that God saw that, and it was evaluated by God and whether he was trustworthy toward his God. When his excellence created enemies, and we read about that a moment ago in Daniel chapter 6, he wasn't defensive. He knew that God was going to judge rightly. As I said earlier, his name really even tells us more about his identity. He's accountable to God alone, not human opinion. And he was uncompromising in that. He had dietary laws he was not going to give in on. Those were things that were very important to him, his integrity and his faith. So there's a lot that we can take away from this. There's a lot of leadership lessons that come out of Daniel for many of us. And I think maybe the first one is that when our work is misunderstood, when we feel like we're going unnoticed, or perhaps others don't see what we're doing or the results we're producing, we have to realize our significance isn't measured by what some other human believes. It's measured by our faithfulness to our Lord. And I think carrying that a step further, when we face the exhaustion of invisibility, and I, for one, have faced that a lot in my career. No one knows what's going on day to day, except for me and a few other people, either within my team or peers throughout the company. But it's a very small group of people that understand what I'm dealing with day to day. We have to realize that we're not leading for human applause. We are doing what we do to reflect God well. And sometimes it means we can't really share the burden, the thing that we're dealing with. But with Daniel, he didn't need to share that with other people. Daniel, he took all that was on his mind to God in prayer. I've just finished reading a book that has really, it's pushed me to up my game with prayer, that it's not this activity that we do even 3 times a day as we read in Daniel, but we walk with God all the time. And so we need to always be bringing what's going on in our lives to God for his advice and his guidance and his prompting. God is the one that we're accountable to. Now, in our lives, sometimes we face things very similar to what Daniel faced, but maybe in a more modern context. Sometimes we have to share tough or bad news, and maybe that's that a significant problem has happened in our area, maybe even because of a decision of either us or our team, but it's important to share that news, and we need to be people of integrity that will do that, even when that bad news is not going to be received well. We also face interesting scenarios at times where maybe the board or the CEO or some other superior has asked or told us to do something that has to remain highly confidential. And so you're taking on activities, or you're conducting activities, or asking others to do things, and you can't really explain to them why that's going on, or maybe they don't see the outcome of what they're working towards because you can't share that with them. You're really often doing behind the scenes work that requires behind the scenes influence, which I think maybe is the best way to think about that. Sometimes you're carrying out orders or business plans that no one knows about. Maybe you're in a company that is acquiring other companies or being acquired. And so there's a lot of highly confidential things, which, by the way, are often legal matters that you can't share with anyone. And so you have this small group of confidants within the company, and sometimes those are not people you're regularly even talking to. So no one in your world necessarily knows what you're doing or why you're doing it. You're working toward this invisible goal, if you will, this thing that can't be shared with other people. Again, I think we can learn a lot from Daniel here. The scenario is totally different. He's serving a king, and that's much different than serving a CEO or the owner of a company or a board of directors or whoever it may be that you serve. Serving a king was sometimes a life and death matters we've already talked about. But we can learn from those same lessons that Daniel learned from, and we can apply that in our day-to-day lives and remember that there is honor in serving like Daniel. He's a great role model for many of us. Daniel led in the shadows for 70 years. He was faithful in decisions that no one else saw. He was excellent in work that few understood and even fewer noted in his life, it seems. But God saw everything that he did. And so that's where I want to leave you this week. This challenge is when you're going about whatever it is you're doing, whether you're a leader in a corporation, a leader in maybe your own business, or perhaps you are just an employee that doesn't have any sort of leadership position, do what you do with excellence. Whatever you're doing, whatever the particular activity is, the decision you're making, or the activity you're conducting, do that with excellence, even if no one else notices, because God does. Do it as if God is your only audience, because in the end, he's really the only one that matters. All that we do, we are to do it as if we are doing it for the Lord. I'm Steve Sanders, and I'm in the trenches with you. And I want you to remember this week, you are called to reflect him well, even when, and maybe even especially when, no one else is watching. God bless.